Exercise 3 is body orientation, and in this section we will use either your skeletal model or maybe a friend or, like I said, your spouse or your kiddos, and try to orient ourselves with respect to the human body. The terms are often paired, and it's often describing the position of one with respect to some other landmark on the body. So the first pair of terms is superior and inferior. Superior would mean above, and inferior would mean below. And again, we would need to think about what particular structures we're considering. We might talk about the clavicle being superior to the humerus, or the reverse of that, the humerus is inferior to the clavicle. But it just depends on where in the body you're interested in. We do tend to think of superior being things sort of above the waist and inferior below the waist, but it doesn't have to be that way. The next pair of terms, anterior, which would be the front of the body, and posterior. So we talk about the anterior and posterior sides. So it says the spine is considered posterior to the chest. That's not really too surprising. The next pair of terms, I need to turn the skeleton for you to see for a moment. The next pair of terms are medial and lateral. Medial would be related to the midline. Lateral would be away from the midline. So we talk about the sternum, for example, being medial to the ribs, or you could say the ribs are lateral to the sternum. And this becomes very important when we look internally. So when we get to the abdominal cavity, for example, when we look at some of the digestive system organs, we'll really use those terms quite a bit. Next pair of terms, proximal and distal. Proximal and distal. Proximal means closer to the point of origin, and distal means far from the point of origin. So we might talk about, for example, the elbow. The elbow would be distal to the shoulder. We could also use that with some of the other bones of the arm. But distal is further from the point of origin. The next pair of terms would be important when we think of something like a dissection, or as we move from the outside of the body to the inside of the body. Superficial, closer to the surface, and deep, closer to the interior. So when we do think about dissections, we talk about some of the layers of tissues, and we think about whether they're superficial, closer to the surface, or deep. And when we get to the histology section, you'll see some of that in play. Dorsal and ventral. We had talked about this in one of the earlier videos. Dorsal would be along the posterior side, so think of that dorsal fin of the shark, and ventral along the belly side. If you're thinking of a human, because we're bipedal, standing on two legs, that's a little different meaning than something like fetal pig, which they have an image of in this exercise. All right, last pair of terms for that sort of body orientation is cephalic. Cephalic is towards the head, and caudal, C-A-U-D-A-L, is towards the tail. Obviously, we don't have a tail, but caudal would be towards the posterior side, and we think of caudal being related to the hip region usually. Again, this might be with respect to another term that we're referring to. So on other organisms, it might be anterior and posterior would be the same as cephalic and caudal, but on humans, it's more like superior and inferior. So there's an anatomy worksheet for you to label some components. Actually, they have this mostly labeled for you, but you could put in some more terms, and then the labeling part is related to a fetal pig. And so as you work through those, if you run into any questions, just let me know. But I think that you'll be able to put those terms in place. The next section, I think I'll just go ahead and go into the next section. So exercise 4, body planes. They really only give you a few. There are really more than this if you get into an advanced anatomy and physiology class. But for our purposes, there are 3 important planes of the body that we would consider. So the first is what we call sagittal, S-A-G-I-T-T-A-L. We do talk about mid-sagittal and parasagittal, and I'll read you the description, then I'll try to show you on the skeleton. The sagittal plane runs longitudinally and divides the body into right and left sections. So mid-sagittal will be right down the middle. We are bilaterally symmetric, meaning each half on either side of that imaginary line would be similar. Not identical, but very, very similar. So mid-sagittal. There's also what we call parasagittal, P-A-R-A, and that would be not the mid-sagittal line, but parallel to that, more lateral, than that mid-sagittal line. So they have an image for you in the exercise to visualize. The next plane that we can consider is what we call the frontal plane, and maybe if I turn the skeleton sideways you can visualize this more clearly. The frontal plane would be dividing the skeleton into sections that would be running into anterior and posterior sections. So the frontal, and sometimes called coronal sections. And then the last, and it doesn't matter, the orientation doesn't matter, but transverse sections would be dividing the body horizontally into planes, transverse or horizontal sections, sometimes called a cross section. So again, they have some questions for you related to that. What they actually recommend that you do, and here's where the fun comes in, and I guess if you have your own video at home, you can feel free to post some pictures back to Blackboard, or maybe I'll make a discussion board for this. This is where they suggest you take a potato and you use a marker and label some of these different components and make some slices. So using those ideas of posterior and in the case that we just talked about, the sagittal plane or the transverse plane, that you make some slices. So they don't really go on and say potato chips, but hey, why not make it into a food lab as well? So I encourage you to try that. I think sometimes putting it into perspective like that really helps. I also encourage you to use your little skeleton models and maybe try to teach this to someone else. A lot of times the terms sound familiar, but when you teach it, you really are forced to think about what it means. So I encourage you to practice.